Zara Altair. This is where we learn to make a good mystery great. And today I want to talk about how to build story in the middle. And this is part 2. First, I'd like to thank my patrons who support my writing and this video series. And if you'd like to support me, the link is in the description below. Okay, how to build story in the middle. Last week we talked about how the first part of the middle expands from the original story premise in the beginning. It's the need to introduce all your characters, to introduce your subplots, and get all those supporting characters on board so you have the whole cast for your story. And then once again, I'd like to note that when I talk about acts, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, I'm talking about the 4-act structure, just to be clear. So today we're going to be talking about the 3rd act. We're going to talk about the midpoint and the 3rd act of your story. And in Act 3, you switch directions. Everything that you've been doing up to that midpoint, when the first part is focused on expansion, now, after the midpoint, we're going to start narrowing the focus. We're going to get closer and closer and closer to the villain. So first let's talk about the midpoint. The midpoint raises stakes and creates greater opposition to achieving the story goal. You're putting new energy into your story and sometimes drastically changing the direction of the story. Your reader's been following along from this start with your detective gathering information and entering suspects and finding the evidence and clues. But right here at the midpoint, something doesn't add up. He's got all this information. She's gone in every direction she can think of. And now something in the middle, this is up to you, but the middle, that midpoint, is a turning point for your story. Oftentimes, your detective, your sleuth, is discouraged and feels like this is just not even worth it. So they find a new direction, or they at least realize that the old direction isn't getting them anywhere, and now they have to look for a new direction. So in that 3rd act, basically, essentially, you're going to pile it on. You're going to make it really, really hard for your detective to identify the villain, because as the story changes after the midpoint, your protagonist is going to feel frustrated and discouraged, and all that work that they did hasn't gotten any results at all. And as the story continues, your sleuth has to rethink everything and approach the solution to the puzzle in a new way. And that is the focus of Act 3, is this whole new way of looking at the puzzle and approaching it and trying to find the villain. The first thing they have to do is identify the new method. And in converse to the first half of your middle, now in the second half, the story begins to narrow down. The reader has explored the world and the victim and their associations, And in Act 3, your sleuth begins a process of elimination, getting closer to the victim. So let's see how this all works. We have that problem, the problem of who killed the victim. And this problem grows in significance in Act 3. It's still there, the big question of who did it, but the regular methods your sleuth used in that first half of the middle are not working, and they start the third act at an impasse. So now your sleuth re-examines the way he looked at the problem and the murder victim. And as he sorts through all the evidence and the clues and the previous conversations with the suspects that he interviewed, your sleuth begins to notice he overlooks some items in that first half. And some clues may turn into red herrings, allowing your sleuth to take a closer look at the remaining clues. And he starts to eliminate suspects as well. And we'll get to that in a minute. So here's your sleuth dealing with this problem, or not dealing with it, certainly not dealing with it successfully. Now that your reader knows your sleuth and they've learned a lot about your sleuth skills in the beginning and definitely in the first half of the middle, we start to look at those strengths and weaknesses, and we start to pile on the trouble. This third act is all about trouble. So we've learned a hero's strength, but now how does that strength lead them into trouble? And how does their weakness get them closer to the villain? The sleuth may do something that seems inappropriate or weak at the time, and yet something there leads them eventually to the villain. We don't know this now in the story, but it does. So you get to play with that a lot, because every obstacle, like a suspect's reluctance to talk, challenges your protagonist. This section is all about challenges. It's all about obstacles. It's all about trouble. And they need to take those skills that the reader learned about in the first half of the middle and combine those skills in new ways. And those new ways, which seem right at the time and approach the problem, lead to new frustrations. Act 3 is all about problems, frustrations, not getting this to the solution. Your sleuth was going to work hard for any scrap of information. You're going to lead her into trouble. You have emotional trouble. You have physical trouble. You have psychological trouble. So pile on the obstacles. Lead your sleuth down wrong paths. And now that you've introduced your reader to the protagonist, keep them turning pages by piling on the trouble, and show your reader how your sleuth handles trouble. I'm trying to think of a way to say this. All this stuff is piling on your sleuth, but at the same time, as these troubles happen, you're narrowing the focus of the story because you are getting closer to the villain. All right, so what happens in the third act with the supporting characters? This is where the supporting characters start showing their true colors. Friends become enemies, and enemies become friends, and surprise reversals keep readers turning pages. So pull out all the stops. Just when your protagonist needs a hand, that reliable friend has something more important to do and doesn't show up. And it could be something from a subplot. That is how you can weave the subplot into your main story plot. Opponents become more difficult. A love interest has second thoughts. A talkative suspect clams up. In other words, you want your supporting characters to add to your sleuth's troubles. That's what this is. This is all about, adding those troubles. Meanwhile, the villain is working behind the scenes to thwart your protagonist. The protagonist and the reader may not know this now, but you keep your villain present and include them with the other suspects who don't behave well. Everybody is giving your sleuth trouble. All right. And then subplots. Act 3 is where you really develop your subplots. In Act 2, you set them up. Now in Act 3, you pile on complications in your subplots as well. And these complications can be reasons that the supporting characters can't help your sleuth, or turn around and don't want to even be involved in the investigation anymore. So Act 3 is the time to really get into your subplots, and make them complicate the main story, and drive those subplots toward the sleuth. Because by the end of Act 3, you're going to start closing off those subplots, especially the minor subplots, because in Act 4, at the end, you really want to focus on solving the puzzle. So you want to have those subplots come up in the second act and get really complicated in the third act, and then resolve a couple of those subplots toward the end of Act 3, so you can focus on the big tension and the climax and the resolution in Act 4. Okay, and in the same way that in Act 2, your protagonist, Sleuth, made a choice that drove them to the midpoint where everything just isn't working. In Act 3, in the middle of Act 3, your sleuth is going to make another big choice, that drives them toward the end. So, fueled by their insight, their road is different now. It's a long way from where they were in Act 2. He may divert from the new path that he chose after the midpoint. And as your sleuth begins eliminating suspects, she may overlook the villain and start down another completely false path that seems like the right decision at that time. And the new direction that she chose after the midpoint will not get her the results she wants. The undiscovered villain may set a trap that confuses your sleuth, and your detective realizes once again they're in over their head and they have to change directions. And now your sleuth must gather forces. She must find new support and discover new evidence and somehow get closer to discovering the murderer. Your sleuth examines all the old evidence with a new, fresh approach. It's a whole new way of looking at everything. He's looking for evidence or suspect statements that he overlooked before, looking at them in new ways. What was that suspect really saying back there in Act 2? Now's the time to re-examine those things, because this choice is a new discovery path, and your sleuth is headed closer to the killer. Okay, the second part of the middle really starts shrinking down the story. In Act 2, we expanded the problem, we expanded the reader's vision of your protagonist Sleuth, we expanded the supporting characters and brought them all on board. And we created the subplots. And now in Act 3, we're combining all those things and causing lots of trouble for your sleuth. So subplots can impact not only the sleuth, but other characters, and those other characters' actions in the subplot affect your sleuth. There's just trouble everywhere. There's trouble everywhere. And as your sleuth starts thinking about things and re-examining things, some of all that information, that big information that happened in Act 2, they start to narrow it down. And often this is the place where the sleuth really starts to examine a suspect, thinks that that suspect is probably the killer, and this is where probably by the end of Act 3 they discover that nope, that was a false trail as well. So the second part of the middle, Act 3, compounds your protagonist's goal with reversals, major conflicts, and surprises that escalate the story's movement. This is what you want to have happen, is all these problems. This is those problems and the compiling of all of those complications and obstructions and the subplots. This is what keeps that middle from sagging. This is what keeps your reader interested. Whoa, my gosh, now here's another problem. How's my sleuth gonna solve this? And the protagonist makes another choice that results in another story direction change somewhere in the middle of Act 3. So you're keeping your reader, oh my gosh, first that stuff in the second act didn't work, and we got to the midpoint and nothing was working, and now all these other things have started happening, and wait, even that isn't working. So in a mystery, the third act pares down the choices, getting your sleuth closer to identifying the victim. But along the way, there's just lots of trouble. So think of your sleuth as on a path. They're on a path. But meanwhile, in Act 3, they've got to chop away the branches and chop away all the things that are in the way and clear that path so they can see where they're going. And Act 3 is all about clearing that path, getting rid of the overgrowth and the dead branches and smoothing the trail to the puzzle's conclusion. And on the way, on that path, your sleuth is on the way to discovering who the villain is and identifying them and confronting them in Act 4. The reason I wanted to break down the middle into these two parts is that this is often where writers struggle. They know the beginning, they know who their sleuth is, they know who the victim is, they know what the problem is, and they oftentimes know the end of the story and how that's going to work. But right in there, the major part of the novel, all these things need to happen in order to keep the reader interested. So I hope breaking this down into Act 2 and the midpoint and Act 3 really helps you understand how to keep things going in the middle so it doesn't sag. And I think if you have those two concepts, the first part of the middle is expanding everything, and the second part of the middle is contracting everything, but with lots of trouble along the way. That's going to help you keep your mystery a lot of fun for your mystery readers. And then mysteries have many moving parts, as you can tell if you've been watching this series for any length of time. There's just so much that goes into a mystery, and plotting, what's it, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4. Plotting can seem overwhelming, and also keeping track of your characters and all the settings and the timeline of your story. It can get big. It does get big. And the tool that I use and I love is called Plotter, Plottr, no E, Plottr, Plotter. And Plotter is an app that helps you keep track of everything, that sets up your timeline so you know where you are in the story. It's a wonderful tool, and you can get a 30-day free trial for Plotter and give it a try. I think if you're starting writing, it's a great tool to help you write. All right, I hope this has helped you with the big middle, the biggest part of your story, and that these breakdowns into Act 2, the midpoint, and Act 3 have helped you understand how you can get keep your mystery exciting as you write, to keep your readers engaged and to keep them turning those pages. All right, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you'll get a notice when the next episode of Write a Killer Mystery is here. Thanks so much.